Once the engine has started, the current that has been drained from the battery must be replaced by the alternator. We've already stated that initially this current flow, which is shown on the load meter, will be quite high, but we also stated that it should quickly reduce as the battery becomes recharged. If no loads at all are selected, then the only current flowing through the load meter will be the battery charging current. Even when the battery is fully recharged, residual charging current will still be about 2 amps. For night flying, for instance, add this 2 amps charging current to the other loads placed on the alternator, and a reading of approximately 32 amps would be representative. If, on the other hand, the load meter reading ever drops to 0 in flight, then this probably indicates that the alternator has failed. This occurrence will be covered in much greater detail later on in this lesson. So far we've only shown the load meter, which has the 0 position on the left side of the dial. Another type of ammeter has the 0 in the center of the dial, as shown here, and is referred to as a center 0 ammeter. Notice that the center 0 ammeter is differently situated in the circuit from the load meter. Whereas the load meter was capable of reading the whole of the output of the alternator, the center 0 ammeter reads the current flowing into and out of the battery. Prior to engine start, with perhaps the navigation lights, the radio, instrument panel lights and the electrical fuel pump selected on, the center 0 ammeter will show by the fact that the needle is indicating in the negative portion of the dial that the battery is discharging. Just after start, when the battery is some way to having recovered its charge, the center 0 ammeter needle will indicate in the positive portion of the dial. This tells us that the alternator is capable of supplying all of the loads and the battery charging current. If, on the other hand, with the engine running, the center 0 ammeter needle is well into the negative portion of the dial, it shows us that the alternator is incapable of supplying demand, and that the battery is discharging. In this situation, it would be wise to start shedding loads. In other words, start switching off those services which are unnecessary, until the ammeter needle once again indicates in the positive portion of the dial. This will then indicate that there is a flow of charge current into the battery. Most malfunctions of the aircraft electrical system will be indicated to the pilot by either the illumination of warning lights or by the readings on the load meter or center 0 ammeter. If the aircraft has an annunciator system, then it's likely that this includes an alternator failure warning light. A test button will be incorporated into the annunciator system to check the light bulb filaments. The ammeter readings have already been covered, but it may help to cover them once more from the point of view of the indications of malfunctions. First, we'll talk about the type of ammeter which has the 0 on the left side of the dial, the load meter. This will indicate alternator failure by the needle going to 0. If the load meter reading appears high after the time the battery would normally have recharged itself subsequent to engine start, this may indicate that the battery has an excessive charging rate. An excessive charge rate will cause the battery to start losing some of the active material off its plates. This will cause serious and lasting damage to the battery. The high charge will also cause the battery to get very hot, possibly so much so that the electrolyte will evaporate, exposing the plates to the air, which once again will cause them damage. Bear in mind that the high charge rate could perhaps be brought about by a faulty voltage regulator. If this is the case, then all of the aircraft equipment will be at risk of becoming overheated and impaired, especially heat-sensitive components like the radio and navigation equipment. The center 0 ammeter will indicate alternator failure by the needle showing a constant, heavy discharge. If the needle stays just in the negative portion of the dial for any length of time, then this is characteristic of the situation where the alternator is incapable of supplying all the loads of the battery at the same time. This will require that some of the loads are switched off. In other words, some judicious load shedding must be done. Otherwise, the battery will eventually be completely discharged. The following drills are not to be considered as being representative of emergency drills for any particular aircraft type. They are purely general recommendations of the type of action which should be considered if an alternator should fail. In the event of either the load meter showing 0, or alternatively the center zero ammeter indicating a heavy discharge, and or the alternator failure warning light being on, the following actions should be considered. Initially, load shed. That is, judiciously select off any electrical, radio and navigation services not vital to the safe operation of the aircraft. If the alternator failure warning light is not illuminated, then use the press to test facility to check its filament. Next, check the field circuit breaker to see if it has tripped. If it looks normal, consider tripping and resetting it anyway. If your aircraft system has overvoltage protection and the circuit breaker has not tripped, these indications may be evidence that the overvoltage relay has tripped. Switch off the alternator master switch and leave it off for about 2 seconds. Try that now. Switch the master switch back on again. Now check the load meter or alternatively the center zero ammeter and also the alternator failure warning light. If the indications are that the alternator output has been restored, then restore the services singly in order of their importance to the safe operation of the aircraft. Do this relatively slowly and deliberately. Allow sufficient time between each service selection for the load to be taken up by the alternator. Should the alternator fail again, then the drill should be repeated, but this time do not select the faulty service. If your attempt at restoring the alternator is unsuccessful, then it would be advisable to reduce the electrical load as much as possible and land as soon as possible. Remember, any radio transmissions you make will seriously reduce the amount of charge left in the battery.